Welcome back to our class. Let's just dive right into chapter 2 here. Talk about theory. And we're going to get a little intellectual today. Let's see, looking around here. Yeah, I got some junk here. Let's put on our thinking caps today. And I'm not communicating a very good message about my qualifications to teach a college class if I wear my cap backwards, so I need to turn it around. Now I look more respectable, right? What am I communicating with wearing a baseball hat here? What's it saying? I'm not outdoors where there's sunshine, and what about when I wear it backwards? I just love that one meme that has a kid watching the baseball game, wearing his hat backwards and shading his eyes. And we ended our last lecture talking about how we cannot not communicate. We're communicating something to somebody all the time. I'm going to communicate right now that I really don't care much about what my hair looks like. I'll toss the cap over here. And let's get intellectual, though. A thinking cap. It's just a figure of speech we use. But if you, this is why I like to study philosophy a little bit. And I'm right there with Giambattista Vico, the great Italian philosopher, who said, you really shouldn't study much philosophy till you're about 30 years old. You're too immature prior to that, and it can really mess up your brain. I'm paraphrasing him. But I've seen that happen to so many people that study philosophy at age 18, 19, 20. My son has a good friend who has read quite a bit of philosophy, probably more than I have. And he's really intelligent, but he has become so cynical that by age 27 or 28, whatever he is now, he's, from a lot of people's perspectives, he's going nowhere with his life. You sit down and talk to him, and the guy's brilliant. He ought to be an engineer someplace, doing wonderful, great things, because he's got the brain for it, but he plays video games with all his free time when he's not asleep or rounding up carts at Target for his job, where he can go around with headphones on all day and just think about what he wants to think. Too much philosophy, not good. A little bit of philosophy, though, is good. And today I do want to show you the difference between two different perspectives of the world. One that we will call scientism, and the other we can call it humanism, if you will. These terms get interchangeable depending on the philosopher who's teaching about them, but those terms help me. Scientism and not scientism, but something else that's a little harder to define because it is unusual to people in our culture to look at things in this way. Although science, up until about the 1780s, all of them looked at things this other way that we call humanism. Okay, two research traditions, we'll call them. Scientism, we can call it objectivism. We're going to be objective about this. We're going to, what do? We do experiments to determine cause and effect relationships between variables. Is this sounding familiar from some of your classes? We have research designs. Some are very complex and some are very simple. I kind of always like reading the research design part of studies, scientific studies, social scientific studies even. Because sometimes they're quite clever. Remember, what they're trying to do is find the variable that has an effect on another variable, cause and effect relationships. If this happens over here, we can expect that to happen. That's the goal here in science. And we do experiments. I'm about to do an experiment. I have a problem. This isn't a communication problem. It's a construction problem. I own a building built in 1928, and it has a crack in the wall from the foundation. In fact, it goes 3 feet underground all the way to the bottom of the foundation. This crack goes all the way up to the top of the wall. And it's about, it's about an inch wide in places. I want to patch it with something. And I've decided to save a little money because I'm a teacher, and Red for Ed hasn't really had an effect yet. And instead of buying the epoxy in one little tube at a time and filling up 2 inches of the gap, and then, because the wall's 18 inches thick, and I've got a gap, and yeah, these little tubes of epoxy sealer to seal cracks, I'm going to need 1,000 of them, a whole pallet full or something. So I've decided I'm going to fix this crack with mortar. So I'm going to experiment like a true scientist, because I love science. And when I was, my first couple of years of college were all about physical science. And I need to seal the crack. So I'm going to experiment with 2 different kinds of mortar that I purchased, with a kind of bonding substance that you mix with the mortar, which is sand and Portland cement. And I'm going to get some pieces of concrete, and I'm going to put blotches of various formulas of mortar and Elmer's glue in one batch. You mix glue in with your mortar and it sticks to concrete better. I'm going to probably do about 6 different formulas on some chunks of concrete I've got and mix them up, even different consistencies, more water or less water, with all the other chemicals being the same. And maybe I'll end up with like 12 different batches mixed up there. It's going to take me half a day to do this. And then I'll let them harden for a week, and then I'm going to get out a chisel and a hammer and see which one is the strongest and which one has bonded to the concrete the best. And that's the formula I will mix to patch my wall crack that goes floor to ceiling. And I've got this building, I've got about 4 or 5 of these cracks to patch. That is scientific experimentation, and it can come to some pretty good answers. But remember, we have informed hunches. I know a little bit about mortar already, and I know a little bit about chemicals, and I have some friends that can advise me well on how to do different mixtures of mortar for this kind of thing. So we're not going at this blind, but that's an experimentation. I've got a research design set up. I'm going to put 6 to 12 different samples of formulas on the concrete, and then I'm going to, what does A cause B? I'm going to see which one is the toughest and stickiest of all of them, and that's the one I'm going to use. I'm doing this so the wall doesn't crack again, and I don't have to redo this in 10 years. So I'll be gathering data about concrete. I've been doing that. I've been reading everything I can, doing my research about concrete repair products that are out there, balancing them with the price. You know, you can't fix something if you can't afford to. I'll do these tests. They're not going to be very statistical tests here, according to the slide, because I'm going to get a cold chisel in my hammer, a lightweight hammer, and tap on it, and tap on them all the same, and I'll kind of get an idea for how easily stuff chips off, and then I'll make notes on it. But this is a test, and I think it'll be possible to find the best one. There could be an unknown best one I've never found. But I'm trying to explain and predict here. Actually, I want to control. I don't want that wall to crack again. So I'm doing this scientific test to find the best way to do it. Okay, you could do that in communication, you know. How am I going to tell my significant other here that I would like to be in a polyamorous relationship, because I believe that's who I am as a person? What words can I say that will have the best effect? Well, I can think of about 3 or 4 things to say, and I'll pick this one because I don't really get to try it out on my friends, or I could go do an experiment and try it out on my friends. And you know, in public relations, you gotta float it out there, and you do some audience analysis and see which message was the stickiest message, or had the most impact on people, or was had the desired impact. So I could design a research around that. I think what I'll find is that you know, the difference is going to be in one case with one way of saying something, I'll just get a pillow thrown at me, and in another case I'll get a shoe thrown at me. So you know, that's one way we do tests on communication. There's other ways. There's a lot of ways we test it, but these are all coming from this scientific research tradition, looking at communication. And we end up, though, getting into communicative acts that are really hard to duplicate in a lab where we can control them, manipulate the variables, and get it just right. Some of these work, and some researchers go to great pains, but I'd say out of all the communication professors out there, there are 9 out of 10 don't do their research this way. It gets too complicated. 1 out of 10, yeah, we have, I think, 2 people in our faculty, in my world, that do this kind of research. I study rhetoric, so this isn't what I do. I'm not in public relations where you literally try out different messages on different audiences or members of the same audience that are randomly selected. Gathering the data, statistical tests to explain and predict. This is scientism. We're being objective about this. I like the picture here. He's doing a lie detector thing, and he's got his machine there that's telling him if the guy's lying or not. It's the nose. You know, look at the nose growing. Yeah, that's how you can tell the lie. And that's where we get away from scientism and into what I'll call humanism. It's this alternative way of looking at typically very complex issues. And with this humanistic research tradition, and this is basically all they did. I mean, Aristotle even said men and women have the same, men have more teeth than women do in their mouths. He never even bothered to go ask his wife to open her mouth and count the teeth and do a little experiment. He just assumed that based on his knowledge of people, and Michel Foucault there in that classic philosopher's pose, holding an idea out there, trying to explain it with the microphone. Yeah, that's what humanists kind of do that. And you can get at some really good knowledge this way. Observing people, just observing people over and over and over, and pretty soon you start to see patterns. Yes, we write them down. We are systematic about this. I want to know more. Let's go start interviewing some people. What do you mean? What did you mean when you did this? And letting them explain what was going on in their head, because we can't know their thoughts. We can only hear the words they give us and interpret them. Our communication model from last week. Artifacts out there, we can study communication artifacts. An example of that would be a speech text by Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, written out. This takes 2 minutes to read it, and it is an artifact that we can study and learn something about Abraham Lincoln. We can learn something about the audience that he believed he was speaking to, right there embedded in the words, or he wouldn't have said that if he thought they were a different kind of person. And also embedded within that text is the kind of people he wanted them to be. It's all right there in the language, in the words, with grammar choices, with the choices of verbs, with his artistic flourishes and style. So this is what we look at when we study an artifact. We might study a cultural artifact where we understand a people better by looking at their pottery. The Greeks are a society that has fascinated modern researchers. They're called philologists now. And they just bury themselves in ancient Greek culture, looking at the pottery, looking at all of the writings that have been preserved. It's probably one of the best preserved cultures from antiquity that we have. And trying to understand these people. And, we have artifacts. We have things that were written. We have the pottery. We have statues. We have architecture. We can look at all of that to understand them better. Thick description is another method we use, typically in studying culture. And it's literally where you go live with a group of people that you're trying to understand their ways of doing things. So I could go up to the Navajo Nation if I were researching this concept called Ke'e, I think it's called, which generally speaking, we'd translate as respect. But in their culture, ke'e is a way of life. Ke'e. Well, I'm going to have to ask Sam at school how to say that. It's a way of life of respect and of letting an elder know what family clans you're from so they know who you are. Yeah, and they in turn let you know their family clans, 4 of them for each of you. And it's a way of living, and in this case of settling problems that respects one another and seeks harmony in the relationships. And people that don't engage in it are thought of as just, you're having a childish temper tantrum. And, you know, I'm fascinated with this concept. I'm just learning about it. And I'm trying to describe it to you, but I have a student that wrote out a document for me, and we can call it thick description, where he tries to describe how this works. And he says towards the end, I'm still not quite getting at all of this, but all of these are components of it. It's literally a way of life in their culture. And I want to know more about it. So I need to get in and do my own interviewing and looking at artifacts and doing my own thick description about it and receiving thick description from others. And there's the interpretation phase, where now we've got all this data from our artifacts, from interviewing, from observing, from the thick description. What does it mean? And here's where the theories come in. We think in this case of ke'e, we could call it a theory of social interaction that maintains the strength of a community, the harmony of relationships between people, and resolves conflict in collaborative, nonviolent ways. So here's a whole communication theory out there that somebody just pulled back the cloak on the closet and let me have a glimpse of, and it's fascinating me because I teach conflict and mediation. And it just sounds like a better way to live than the way American culture handles conflict with, I'm going to win. Then we have the analysis. After we interpret, this is probably where the theories happen, and we really analyze and begin to just explain and provide as much information about this as we can that helps to understand it. Analyzing is cutting something up and dividing it, literally from the Greek. Dividing things into constituent parts and explaining all of them. This is very different than the scientific research methods that are very effective for one kind of knowledge, and the humanistic methods that are very effective for other kinds of knowledge. Some things just can't be measured with scientific instruments. And other things should be, because they're very measurable. And the scientific method that we learn in our science classes is effective. But it can only handle layers of complexity that the researcher themselves is able to understand and design mathematical analyses to help do the interpretation and analysis. This is where our intuitions come into play in this humanistic research world. Okay, I threw this term out the other day, epistemology. It's an easy term. Episteme means knowledge. Ology is a study of. So it's a study of the origin and nature of knowledge. We are talking about 2 different epistemological approaches to knowledge here. One is the scientists, and the other are the humanists. The scientists are what we call essentialists. Essentialism is their philosophy. Things have an essence. We can divide this up and we can find that essence, we can describe it, we can explain, predict, and even control that essence. We are into discovering truth, because truth is out there, it is. And we just need to discover it and explain it and figure it out. This is all about nature, and we mostly learn by observation, looking at the data. Scientism, it's a valuable way to look at the world and to resolve problems like I'm going to try with my wall patch mixtures. Then over here you've got these humanists that probably just looking at a different side of the elephant here, if you remember that old proverb. Things don't have an essence to the humanistic perspective. You know, you're not discovering your true self with this. Like the essentialists would say, you really are somebody, you need to discover it, you know, give us time and we'll find the genes and the chromosomes that made you this way, because you are this and you get to discover it. The humanists would say, no, we socially construct our world. Who do you think you are? You have been shaped that direction throughout your life, from childhood, from birth, by parents, by events, by your education, by everything in your life serves to shape you, to mold you in some way. All of these social forces are acting upon you. We've got 9 good theories that talk about even how gender is shaped and molded by your culture and by others, and even by your own thinking about yourself. Socially constructed. Reality is created by the agreement among all of us that this is what's true. It's a different kind of epistemology. Scientists just tend to really push that aside or say, okay, that's fine over there in sociology and psychology. We want to do the real science. But then they drift back over and want to find the genes that make somebody into a sociopath. When really, maybe the sociopath was raised without any empathy from a parent, and maybe it happened by age 2, and so you come along at age 6 and you're pulling the wings off of bugs and feeling no empathy, and it gets worse. You're stealing from other kids throughout grade school, and it gets worse, and you turn into a teenager that goes down a criminal road, and you happen to be really smart, because most sociopaths are very intelligent, more than average, and you realize you can cheat at business. And you can make a lot of money that way by cheating at business, by breaking the law and being clever about it so that you don't get caught. And even getting into management and organizations, my organizational background is sneaking in here, and realizing that you can lie your way to the top, you can lie your way into promotions. Hey, if you're really a sociopath, you're probably pretty sharp up here to begin with, and you can kind of back those lies up with a little bit of education and learning. And you know, I heard one corporate CEO said, yeah, I hired people to write all my papers all the way through college. Wow. And you know, he also said, and that was actually good training for how I run my business today. It's interesting. This corporate CEO world are an interesting bunch of people, and it's a tough world to survive in too. A reality gets created in socially constructing things. We choose the world we live in a way. No, we don't really choose it. We're shaped into it, but then we make a choice somewhere, and all of these kind of variables come in with social constructionism. We create a reality, sometimes consciously, sometimes not so much. It's all about nurturing instead of nature. Nurture, you know, you've heard the nurture-nature debate. That's what we're dealing with here. It's more about interpretation of what happens than observation of what happens. And that interpretation helps to come back around and reinforce what we're socially constructing. Is this making sense? Examples of a socially constructed thing, we could just say culture. In Mexico, I'm most familiar with Mexican culture as opposed to American culture. It's a more collectivist society. They value family very highly. It's communities work together, much more so. Where in America we're much more individualistic, and I want to find my purpose in life. And in Mexico, maybe your purpose is to keep your family together solid, to take care of your elders. Where does that come from? Are these things embedded in our DNA? No. Poorer countries tend to be much more collectivistic because we need one another just to survive. And we take a lot of pleasure from one another and having a good time together with things like singing and dancing and telling stories. The individualistic culture, we want to succeed, and in a very wealthy society like the United States, we can invent a process or start a business or something and make an awful lot of money and we find our pleasure in the things we buy, our motorcycles, our boats, our fancy Tesla cars, and we travel around in our RVs, and we take pleasure more in those immediate people around us and doing things and having things more so. So these two differences can really nicely be explained by this social constructionist philosophy. If you're a scientist and you think, no, it's something genetic in the people of Mexico that they just, don't succeed and prosper as much. Well, the constructionists would come around and say, wait a minute, they were colonized until well into the 1800s, and they've had a very oppressive governmental system since then, unlike the United States that broke free in the 1700s and has had a less oppressive governmental system. Social constructionism explains much when it comes to culture, much more than scientists can say. Okay, we're about done here. So, objectivist, here's another term I'll throw out to you, the yellow terms. Determinism, things are just determined. You were born this way. I'm going to disagree with Lady Gaga when she crawled out of the egg at the Super Bowl and did her big dance and song, Born This Way. Biology is destiny. I have a friend, a sociologist, back at Indiana University. She's gay, and I thought, enlighten me here. I don't know everything about her culture, literally. And I said, what about the gay gene? Are we having any luck really nailing that down? I'd read some about it, because I do teach gender and communication. And she says, we gave up looking for that. We get these interesting studies, but nobody can duplicate the study. We just can't nail it down, so we don't care anymore. We want rights. We want acceptance. And I thought, okay, people need to stop treating other people badly. And, and we get into a problem with objectivism like this, that if you do find out, oh, you were born this way, how can anybody criticize you then? We have to accept you because you're born that way, but the evidence isn't there. But we should accept you because you're a person, you're a human being. And, do we have any compassion? Do we have any sympathy? Do we have any sense of fairness and justice? We are socially constructing in fairness and justice into our society today, probably as much as we've had since the 60s. We'll return to this thought later on when we talk about structuration theory. Biology is destiny. And the way you talk about it is, I had to do this. I was born this way. Politically, we're happiest ruled by a monarch that says, this is how it shall be. That would be the working out in a political philosophy. I'm not saying you or I would be happy with that. But the idea that a king has blue blood and was born to rule was even set apart by God, ordained by God to rule this country. That's objectivism. In religion, we find it in Christian religion, Calvinist theology that says, you are destined. This is in the Force in Star Wars. Luke, it's your destiny. And versus Arminianism that says, hey, you've got free will in this, you've got choice, you can do what you want to do. In education, do we have the rigorous education that just you're going to learn this stuff and whack in the back of your knuckles to make you learn it? We kind of rejected that. And we want a freer, more open educational system that inspires us to curiosity and learning. That's what I'm trying to provide here. So, with interpretive free will, human agency instead of biology, which means we're either selecting what we want to do or we're getting shaped into it by other forces we necessarily didn't choose or want. It just happened because life's tough. We decide to do something. In the grammar of it, in the politics, we want democracy, self-rule. We value that in this country. In religion, you have the right to choose your religion, and you can choose that other religion. God's not predestining you to be Islam or Christian or Jewish or anything. It's up to you here. or it's up to the culture that surrounds you that shapes you into it, we could say. In education, we want freedom in the education, creativity, the love of learning, rather than what this country used to have with, I remember teachers with paddles back in the 70s. We were right at that point where they quit spanking, but they all had their paddles in class and threatened us, but I never saw a kid get spanked by a teacher, except once in high school, and the teacher lost his job. Okay, so objectivist or interpretivist, we're on different sides of the scale here, the interpretive side, the objectivist side, and we just understand the assumptions underneath this, because our theories come from one of these epistemological places or another, either out of the, biology is something, and your genes do matter, and it does affect you in many ways. But it's not everything. And the culture you live in and the way you're shaped as a child and formed into an adult matters. It makes a big difference, but it's not everything either. And somewhere we've got a balance in all this. And as a communication theorist, as a person in communication, as an educated person, hold each of these in its proper place. Use them when they work. Use the right theory for whatever you're examining and looking at. Let the evidence speak for itself. And remember, knowledge is never neutral. Knowledge always does something or creates a situation that affects our reasoning. So there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with knowledge. Now I'm going to take you just into a little dark side of this for a minute. Beware of the rhetoric of science. Rhetoric, now there's a humanistic activity. We persuade people to do things by using arguments and likelihoods and probabilities, even deception. That's not pure persuasion. It just works really well. And science would say, no, it is. It's like this, it's how it is, and we have to accept it because that's what the data says. Well, I've just tried to make a case that it's both of these going on. Now, the rhetoric of science comes in, and it's when, particularly refers to science makes probable arguments, always. They're never 100% certain arguments. That's the field of abstract mathematics. You get into real science with experimental research, and there's always a probability factor. Sometimes a very, very low one, but there's always is one, and that's the mathematics of it. It gets even more interesting where, well, scientists will want to deny that. No, we have these writings, and that proves that it's absolutely true. Scientists love absolutes. Humanists, we can deal with differences, we can deal with uncertainties, because we know the world's complicated and we just keep thinking about it and coming up with better theories. What happens when a respected leading professor has his work challenged, their life's work that they're published with? They published books, they go do lectures, everybody applauds when they give a lecture, and some brilliant young upstart researcher, 26 years old, comes along and has a different theory, and that theory, if you accept it, totally overturns the respected established professor's work. Well, that exact thing happened in about the 1920s. A young scientist, a geologist, came up with the idea of plate tectonic theory. All the continents are on these geologic plates and they slide around over the surface of the earth. And we can tell, look at the puzzle pieces, they all fit together. Didn't you see that when you were about 5 years old? I did. And there were established scientists that just, no, that's not how it works. You don't have the proof. Interesting idea, you don't have the proof. But they were able, because they controlled the science departments at the big universities. They were the department chairs. These respected scientists were the journal editors who decided what gets in the journal and what do we reject. And the publication and spread of this plate tectonic theory was held down from the 1920s, when it was actually, people in the 1870s were talking about it, but it was held down from the 1920s based on the argument, you can't explain how. And so nothing got published. My first year of college was 1978. My geology textbook from 1978 had 1/2 a page, one paragraph on plate tectonics. One paragraph. You look in any self-respecting geology textbook today, this was a 300 level class even, and they will have at least a chapter on plate tectonics in your basic geology textbook. And today, my dog is communicating with me. She's sending me a message. I wonder what she could mean. I'll be right back, so I think I know what she means. I have properly received that message from her and interpreted it correctly. I opened the door and let her out. Successful communication. Yeah, that theory was held down. Now you can take a whole class in plate tectonics from the geology department. And it was because those stodgy old professors were not going to let that theory move forward because it overturns their work. And they basically, instead of saying, wow, this is really interesting, let's all explore it together, they silenced the theory until the 1960s, when another researcher came along and said, hey, I've got evidence for it of how it happens now. Then they couldn't dismiss it. That was 1960s, 1950s. It still only had one paragraph in my 1978 college textbook. Even then, some last remnants, some last holdover professors held down that theory until, frankly, they died. And the new young scientists took over and they said, yeah, we want to know more about this. Let's start publishing. And it became a much bigger field and has been widely accepted as the better theory than whatever they taught before. The rhetoric of science, silencing people, is an action, and it's very rhetorical. And beware of scientists who will not consider other evidence or other theories. They need to at least politely say, yeah, you're onto something. This is interesting evidence. I don't see how it fits in here, but it's something. Let's sharpen our theories. That's good science. That's good communication theorizing as well. When you find a situation that isn't quite explained by the current theories. And as far as I can see, communication's a little better about accepting new ideas like that. Still, you got to impress those old professors if you want to get published. And sometimes it's easier to do that in an area where nobody's done much research and they don't have as big a stake of somebody overturning the research. Okay, so that was my rant. Scientism, Objectivism, Essentialism on the one hand, on the other side we have Humanism, interpretation, social constructed realities. Somewhere in between the two of those, we start to get the puzzle pieces to put together this very complicated world we live in. Okay, learn those terms: epistemology, scientism, and humanism. And recognize many philosophers use different terms, but if you listen to a little bit, you'll put them in one camp or the other. Oh, you believe it is and we discover it, and you believe we create it through human agreement and shape the world that way. Those are the two research perspectives. Those are the two major schools of thought in the world of philosophy, and I want you to be fluent in that vocabulary. Use that throughout your work in the class, and recognize it when you see it out there, and do not dismiss either one out of hand because you tend one way or the other. But remember, we've got to bring them together to get our best shot at putting this puzzle of this world together. All right, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later, and have a great day.